This election is unique because we see that it illustrates a broad coalition that speaks to the things I've been talking about for years in sort of the most transparent way that we've seen. I've talked about how I always thought that the battle wasn't really between Republican and Democrat for me, but it was about voices that were pro establishment versus voices of average Americans that tend to not have their opinions ever heard. If we don't have the voices of Americans heard through free and fair elections, whether it be Republicans, Democrat, white, black, straight, gay, Muslim, Christian, atheist, all of these groups, if your voice doesn't matter, then any discussion we have on specific policy initiatives also won't matter. It doesn't matter how well you could articulate that certain policies should be established if the people that really run the country don't care about your voice and your vote doesn't matter to ultimately swaying that decision. For example, we could see that over 80% of people think that voter ID and one-day in-person voting should be the norm. It does not matter that that is the overwhelming majority of Americans. The people that run the show have decided that won't be the case. What this election represents is that you have people that, for whatever reason, if you're a Republican and you're someone who's been a fan of Donald Trump for a long time, it's because you think Trump is sticking up for the American people, and he saw people that weren't being represented by this leviathan, or as he calls it, swamp, of unelected bureaucrats, corporate interest, people in our mainstream media, institutions like academia and the entertainment industry, and other institutions that are really running the show. And he sought to give a voice to the people that he respected, such as blue-collar workers. That's what millions of people in rural America think. That's what people in my community think. That this Manhattanite billionaire has something that they could look to and say, at least this guy respects us. Something that's been absent in the national political scene for so long for these people. Or maybe you dislike Donald Trump and you think that it's all selfish. But understand that he's still viewed as someone who's outside that establishment. And as are people that seemingly have little in common with him when it comes to political ideology, such as Tulsi Gabbard or RFK. Then you see people like Elon Musk, people like Ron Paul. You see people that traditionally would have never even considered voting for the Republican Party that this year are standing up. You see people like Brett Weinstein, who's of the intellectual dark web. You see other people that are on sort of platforms like that. What is it about this ticket that they're representing? It is that it is a bunch of people that are outside the big club and realize that that club is being used to beat average people over the head and ensure that their voice isn't heard. The most anti-democratic thing that I've seen in national level politics in my life is the gaslighting by almost every major institution in this country of the mental cognitive health of Joe Biden. And then once they got the de facto win in the primary with him, forcing him out against his will and installing Kamala Harris, who didn't receive one vote. And why? What was the goal? Because they did not trust the voters of the Democratic Party, because they're actually, despite their rhetoric, not interested in democracy whatsoever. They are interested in having someone that they will be able to reliably control so that people behind the scenes can really run this government and your voice doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you vote for Kamala Harris because you're not really voting for the policies of Kamala Harris, which you don't really know what those policies are anyways because she's changed them so much despite the fact saying that her values have remained the same. None of that matters because in reality, you're just voting for people behind the scenes that are going to run the show. And the same was true of Joe Biden, which they now admit. They know that they can't run on policies, which is why the Democratic ticket, which is just the face of this establishment, runs closer and closer to policies that represent more traditional conservative policies. Kamala Harris is talking about being pro-Second Amendment. They're talking about securing the border. They're talking about all sorts of positions that we traditionally would see would be positions that would be more centrist or conservative leaning. And why? Because they know they can't defend their positions. They rely on control of the narrative through these institutions to convince enough people that their opponents are scary enough that you have to vote for them in perpetuity and just close your eyes and give them power and trust us, next time things will work out for you. Meanwhile, Americans struggle to pay for groceries. They cite statistics. But inflation's only 2.4%. Yes, year over year, after it's gone up 10% at sometimes year over year. Most groceries and staples that people were purchasing have gone up 30% in a Harris-Biden administration. There's also been the cost of other essentials such as fossil fuels, gasoline, rent, mortgages. The American people are struggling. You're trying to be gaslit by all of these institutions, including our mainstream media, that isn't holding truth to power, but is designed to be propagandist to convince you not to believe your lying eyes. Just like they tried to convince you that Joe Biden's cognitive health wasn't slipping, they tried to convince you that the border was secure. They tried to convince you that the economy was great. They tried to convince you that crime wasn't a problem and that the world was safe under a Harris-Biden administration. And yet, a cursory look at any of this could see that none of that's true. We don't need the opinions of experts that are going to make predictions into how things go, particularly when those experts have been wrong over and over again recently. The same economic experts that predicted Donald Trump's economy would be a disaster predicted for you that a Harris-Biden economy would be amazing. In both cases, they were wrong. They predicted that lockdowns were necessary and wouldn't negatively impact the economy in a serious way. Once more, they were wrong. Now they're predicting to you, trust us, this time we'll be right. Just vote for Harris, all the economists sign on. Oh, and by the way, all the foreign policy people sign on. Oh, and by the way, all the intel agency people sign on, and et cetera, et cetera. But we see the record. Regardless of the gaslighting and the excuses that are tried to be made, the American people know that when it comes to the issues that matter most to them, the economy, the border, the world not being on fire and actually being remarkably peaceful, that Donald Trump was superior in every way to a Harris-Biden administration. And you may say, well, Harris was only VP. In her own words, she admits she would have done nothing different. She can't think of anything. Joe Biden said in his own words that one of the last people in the room in almost every decision he made and an integral part of his administration was Kamala Harris. What this election represents is policies that benefit the American people, a record that clearly shows it was more beneficial. And most importantly, a coalition of people that have come together from the traditional right, left, and everywhere in between that want to make America healthy, that want to make America affordable again, and want to make Americans have a voice once more, whether they be people that traditionally voted Republican or Democrat Party. As we get closer to the eve of the election, we can see the desperation from these institutions. More and more hoaxes they brazenly spread. Their message seems to be a stand-up comic said something bad once. Or Donald Trump said that he wanted Liz Cheney executed when he makes the argument that many of my friends on the left, and myself included in the anti-war right, have made for generations. Before the chicken hawks decide to vote to send our soldiers to war, maybe they ought to stop and think about what if it was them or their family that was being put on the front lines. And yet, despite this quite reasonable statement that Trump made, he's being treated as it was the most offensive thing that's ever been said in an election. The man survived 2 assassination attempts. When they couldn't beat him legitimately, they tried to beat him through violence. When they couldn't beat him through violence, they tried to beat him with denigrating his name. When they couldn't do that, they tried to beat him with lawfare. It's not about Donald Trump. It's not even about the people down ticket and the actual officials that are running, or people like Elon Musk, or Tulsi Gabbard, or Ron Paul, or RFK. It's about you as an American having the right to want policies that benefit you. It's about your right to be able to be heard when you see the actual problems that are occurring in this country. It's about having a voice where you'll be able to have input and actually have the respect of people that will allow your vote to occur in areas like primaries, as opposed to the Democratic Party that now will just not only not trust the American people in general, but have a disdain for their very voters who they didn't trust enough to pick someone in a primary that they found acceptable. Regardless of your political beliefs, whether you be paleo-conservative, a Christian nationalist, a libertarian, a Green Party, Constitutional Party, any sort of minarchist, all of these ideologies, if you ever want to pierce the veil of the establishment that doesn't care about your voice, now is the unique time in history to be able to do it. Lastly, an election of Kamala Harris and the institutions behind her will lead to a censorship of the very ability to have discussions such as this. We see that 2 former secretaries of state, and John Kerry and Hillary Clinton, have both said that the First Amendment is a problem. We've seen the censorship that they've employed. We've seen the Harris-Biden administration go after parents at school board meetings. We've seen them use lawfare against their political opponents. We've seen them use censorship. And we've seen them push for a further war on disinformation. And what does disinformation mean to them? It has nothing to do with whether or not something's truthful or a lie. It has everything to do with information that the establishment institutions find uncomfortable. That's all it is. If it's a lie but it benefits the institutions, no problem. It's not disinformation. But if it's the truth that harms them, well then it needs to be censored. It doesn't matter what side of the political ledger you're on. If you appreciate discussions like this and the ability for people to have robust disagreements on all sorts of policies, whether it be coming from a left wing or right wing perspective, if you want to be able to afford groceries, if you want a secure border, if you want a world that's not on the precipice of World War III, in all of these areas, the decision is clear. A vote for Donald Trump, and more importantly, the ticket that surrounds him, and down ballot for the Republicans this year, is the best way to achieve all of those goals. And what do you have that to weigh against? Trump's a threat to democracy. All of these hoax claiming what Trump said. And some comedian said something. So I implore you, get out, encourage people, go vote for the Republican ticket. It does not make you an immoral person. It doesn't mean that you can't think that Donald Trump has personality quirks that you don't like whatsoever. It doesn't mean that you're signing off that you think Trump is the greatest person that ever existed and that he alone will save us. No one's suggesting any of that. But it is clear that he is the superior choice in this election. And even if you're on the left and you want a more sensible Democratic Party, the only chance that you'll ever receive that is for them to receive a loss in this election, to encourage them to going back to being a party that at least attempts to represent the people, instead of being unelected bureaucrats that subvert your right to even have a vote in the most basic of institutions, which would be the primary of your own political party.